Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we are going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite bands, Pink Floyd. Of all of the bands that I've covered so far in my tier lists, Pink Floyd is definitely the one that I've been listening to for the longest period of time. I've been a huge fan of theirs since I was in either 8th or ninth grade, so they've been a very important band to me for quite some time. They're a group that has produced some of my favorite albums of all time, and I think they are a great example of a band that can have two different frontmen who differ a lot in terms of their compositional styles, the subject matters that they write about, and the timbre of their voice. But in the midst of all of those differences, they still manage to balance each other out so beautifully and provide each other the perfect contrast. And in my opinion, Roger Waters and David Gilmour are one of the greatest pairings to come out of rock music. So I'm very excited to be covering this band, and what I'm going to do is go through all 15 of their studio albums, starting with The Piper at the Gates of Dawn and ending with The Endless River, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments as well. I would love to hear where you agree and disagree and how you would rank each of these albums, so please let me know your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, we will start out with their debut studio album from 1967 titled The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. I'm going to give this one an A. Good album. I really enjoy this one. Obviously, it is much different from every other Pink Floyd album that would follow it due to the fact that this is their only release that featured Syd Barrett in the driver's seat for the majority of the album. He wrote 8 of the 11 songs entirely by himself, while 2 others were done collaboratively, and 1 song was written by Roger Waters. David Gilmour was also not a part of the group at this point either, so that's another factor as to why this album contrasts so much from the releases that would follow it. And because of that, it does seem like some Pink Floyd fans are pretty divided on this album. Some people are not a huge fan of it, while others hold it in very high regard and consider it to be one of their best albums. And I've always been somewhere in the middle with this one. I definitely enjoy it, and I think it's a really solid album, but I also wouldn't put it up there with some of my favorite Pink Floyd albums either. But to me, this is a really solid psychedelic and experimental rock album, and of the small amount of music that Syd Barrett did record in his life, I do think that this is his greatest musical contribution that he did put out there, and I think about 90% of the most standout tracks that he did write throughout his life do happen on this album. I enjoy the majority of this album. It does have a couple of more experimental tracks here and there that I do feel like are a little bit of work to get through for me personally, but I do think that about 80 to 85% of this album is very strong. I think the high point for me is the opening 3 tracks, which I think are all just such amazing songs, particularly the opening track, Astronomy Domine, which is my favorite song on here and one of my favorite psychedelic rock songs of all time. Just such an interesting and trippy song with so many exotic sounds going on and really dissonant chord movements. Just an amazing song to open up with. I also think that tracks 8 to 11 from The Gnome up to Bike is another very strong succession of songs. So I think that the opening couple and then the final couple tracks are the high points of the album for me, and those are all Syd Barrett songs as well, so I do think that he really did carry this album. I really like how the album concludes with Bike as well, which ends things on a more poppy, upbeat, and comical sounding psychedelic track. The 2 instrumental collaborative songs are the ones that I struggle with the most and are ultimately what bumps this album down a tier for me. And I don't think that the Roger Waters song on here is bad, but I do think that all of the songs that Syd Barrett wrote on his own are really what do carry this album. So unfortunately, this is the only release of Pink Floyd where we will hear a large contribution of songs from Syd Barrett, but definitely a solid debut album with some amazing psychedelic rock songs. So this one gets an A. Okay, next we have their second studio album from 1968 titled A Saucerful of Secrets, and I will give this one a B. Not a bad album, but I do think it is a little bit of a downgrade from the first release. This album would mark a turning point in the personnel of Pink Floyd due to the fact that Syd Barrett would suffer some serious mental health issues during the recording of this album, and he would leave the group before the album's completion, and that is how David Gilmour ended up coming into the mix, and he would appear on the majority of the songs on this album album, and Sid would only contribute musically on 3 songs, and the album would only feature 1 track written entirely by Syd Barrett. Roger Waters and Richard Wright would take over the majority of the remainder of the songwriting duties throughout this, and I think the majority of the songs on here are really cool. There's definitely an eeriness and a psychedelic darkness to a lot of these songs, particularly the opening 3 tracks, and I really enjoy that mood, and I think it contrasted from Syd Barrett's writing style on the first album very nicely. Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun is easily my favorite song on here, and one of the trippiest and eeriest songs of the late 60s Pink Floyd period, in my opinion. Similar to what I said about the first release, the title track on here is a longer, more avant-garde and experimental track, and that is one of the songs that does take away from this album a little bit for me and kind of feels like work to get through it. And the final track is the one Syd Barrett track on here titled Jug Band Blues. I don't find this song as enjoyable as a lot of the stuff that he did on the first album. I wouldn't say it's a bad song, but in comparison to the first release, I do think that this song isn't as solid as some of the other stuff that he put out. So there are a few things that I'm not crazy about with this album, but at the same time, like I said, I think they put out a couple of really awesome, really dark, psychedelic tracks, and 2 of my favorites being Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun and the opening track, Let There Be More Light. And I think Roger Waters definitely carried this album and did a good job of establishing a new sound for them to build off of in the absence of Syd Barrett. So pretty good album. I will give this one a B. Alright, next we have their 3rd studio album and first soundtrack from 1969 titled More, and I will give this one a C. I've always struggled with this album. There are a few things that I like about it, but largely I've always found it pretty underwhelming. This is a weird album for Pink Floyd in a lot of ways. It's at a weird point in their discography and their formation as a band, because we had The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which had established that Syd Barrett sound with minimal compositional input from Roger Waters and the rest of the group. And then we transitioned into a different Pink Floyd sound on album 2, A Saucerful of Secrets, with Roger Waters and Richard Wright taking over the majority of the songwriting throughout that album, with only minimal contribution from Syd Barrett as he would leave the group. And then be replaced by David Gilmour, and that would also change the sound and the direction of the group. So once we get to this album, this is the first release to feature no Syd Barrett and have what is regarded as that classic Pink Floyd lineup with Roger Waters, David Gilmour, Richard Wright, and Nick Mason. And on this one, we have Roger Waters covering the majority of the songs on side 1, with collaborations from everyone else in the group for the majority of side 2. But I think the fact that it was a soundtrack put more confines on the band to have to write more for the mood of the movie rather than explore this new sound and writing process with this new lineup. And because of that, I think it translated into a mediocre album that only really has a few cool songs scattered throughout. It does have a lot of dips in momentum and a lot of skip over tracks for me, but there are a couple of songs that are really beautiful and still incorporate those psychedelic elements of that Pink Floyd sound from the late 60s. For me, the 3 standout tracks on here are the opening song, Cirrus Minor, as well as Crying and Cymbeline, all tracks that I consider to be really amazing songs. And side 2 has a couple of really cool instrumental moments, but it's very much the type of music that I need to be in a particular mood to listen to. And I much prefer the vocal tracks on here to the instrumentals, because I think the vocal songs are the most similar to what the future Pink Floyd would sound like. So I would say this is a weirdly placed album at a tough time in their discography, and it resulted in this subpar movie soundtrack with a couple of really solid songs that give us a nice taste of that late 60s psychedelic Pink Floyd. So not the greatest album. I will give this one a C. Okay, moving on, we have their 4th studio album from 1969 titled Ummagumma, and I will also give this one a C. I've never been the biggest fan of this album. On this one, each member of the group contributes compositionally, with each of them getting half an LP's worth of music, which is definitely an interesting idea for them at this point in their discography, but I don't think it translated into a really good and cohesive album, and ultimately a lot of the band ended up not being happy with this album. It opens up with a 4-part song by keyboardist Richard Wright titled Sisyphus, which takes us through 4 tracks with very different moods and directions. And other than part 3, I actually find each of these pretty enjoyable. Part 1 and 4 have very cinematic qualities to them, both in very different ways, and I really like the piano work on part 2, some very cool jazzy and impressionistic sorts of harmonies going on. With that being said though, it's definitely not a standout Pink Floyd song for me by any stretch, and And then side one concludes with two Roger Waters tracks titled Grantchester Meadows and the mouthful of a title, Several Species of Small Furry Animals Gathered Together in a Cave and Grooving with a Pict. The first track features bird chirps going on in the background of the entire song with acoustic guitar and singing over it. I think this is one of the better songs on this album. I like the mood of the song. To me, it's very peaceful and serene, but also slightly eerie at the same time. And I love Roger's vocal melodies. I think they're really pretty over the acoustic parts. The song after that drastically changes gears and brings us into a very eerie and trippy track with all sorts of animal sounds sequenced and sped up and layered on top of one another with these really trippy reversed voice sequences. Certainly an interesting and very experimental song, but not one that I'm particularly crazy about. It's something I need to be in a very particular mood to listen to. And then after that, side two opens up with a three-part David Gilmour composition that is a little over 12 minutes long, titled The Narrow Way. I don't mind these three tracks, and of the four band members, I would say I like David Gilmour's contributions on here the most, particularly with part three, which is definitely the standout track on here for me. And then the album concludes with a three-part Nick Mason song titled The Grand Vizier's Garden Party. And other than the opening track to Dark Side of the Moon, I believe this is the only other Pink Floyd track that Nick Mason got writing credits on his own for. If I'm wrong about that, please correct me in the comments. But this one does very little for me, unfortunately, with the exception of some of the flute parts on part 1 and 3. But of the four writing contributions, Nick Mason's is definitely the weakest for me on this album. And in general, the more avant-garde tracks throughout here are what take away from it for me. And while there are a handful of individual songs that I do enjoy, I don't think that they really blend together in the best fashion. And because they are all so different stylistically, I think this album is a little too scattered and all over the place for me and not very coherent. And I think they will eventually find a better balance between all of their different writing styles. But on this one, I don't think that they had found that perfect balance yet. So I think it was a cool idea to try this out for an album, but I don't think it translated into the greatest album, unfortunately. So this one gets a C. All right, now we have their fifth studio album from 1970 titled Adam, Heart, Mother, and I will give this one a B. Not a bad album. I wouldn't say it's exceptional, but I do think that the individual songwriting contributions from Roger Waters, David Gilmour, and Richard Wright are pretty good. Side one consists of one song, which is the title track, Adam, Heart, Mother, and it is almost a 24-minute long song divided into 6 parts, and by far Pink Floyd's longest song to date. And it veers in and out of a lot of different instrumental sections and different moods and feels. I think this song is okay, but in the grand scheme of longer Pink Floyd tracks that we will see more and more as their discography continues, this has never been one of the standout ones for me. A couple of things that I do enjoy throughout this track are the brass sections in the beginning, as well as the use of the choir, and David Gilmour's solos are really solid. But like I said, not one of the standout longer Pink Floyd tracks for me, but I do appreciate the effort. And then side two opens up with a Roger Waters acoustic track titled If. I've always found this song to be very pleasant and sweet sounding, and this is my second favorite track on here. And then we have Summer 68, which is my favorite song on here. It's a really beautifully done track by Richard Wright, and in my opinion, it's Richard Wright's best composition up to this point. I absolutely love the contrast in the two sections, with the opening being much more peaceful and serene, and then getting darker and more intense for section 2. The brass parts really add to the intensity as well. And then we continue with Fat Old Son, which is David Gilmour's composition on here. I think this song is okay, but definitely not one of my favorites and not a standout David Gilmour track for me. And of the Waters, Wright, and Gilmour solo tracks on here, this is definitely my least favorite of the three. And then the album concludes with another longer 13-minute track titled Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, a song that establishes a few different moods and then abandons them and goes into different feels after a while. I don't dislike this song, but I also don't think it's one of the stronger Pink Floyd songs either, especially when you compare it to other songs that are on the longer side of things. I do think that Pink Floyd has mastered the art of writing really long songs that completely keep your attention the whole time, but I don't think that they had mastered that yet on this album, but they certainly will in future releases. There are some instrumental sections throughout this song that I do find enjoyable, but as a song, it's never been a standout track for me. So as you can see, the opener and closer are so-and-so for me, with a few musical moments throughout that I do enjoy, but the other three tracks I find pretty consistent, with David Gilmour's being the only one that I'm not not the biggest fan of, but we have a really solid Roger Waters track, and Summer 68 is my favorite Richard Wright song to date. So not a favorite album in the Pink Floyd discography for me, but definitely not a bad release either, and an improvement upon the past couple of albums. So I will give this one a B. All right, next we have their 6th studio album from 1971 titled Meddle, and I will give this one an A. I really enjoy this one, and up to this point, I think this is the best album that they have put out, but I still wouldn't say that it's strong enough to be an S tier. This album features compositional collaborations from everyone in the group, and it consists of 6 tracks, with the first 5 all being on side 1. It opens up with One of These Days, which is a cool instrumental psychedelic track with this bass line with delay on it, serving as the foundation of the really driving groove. A cool opener for sure, and then it leads into a beautiful track with David Gilmour on vocals titled A Pillow of Winds. I absolutely love the peaceful and serene mood that this song gives off. The combinations of the electric and acoustic guitars is very tasteful. David Gilmour's vocal melodies are very pretty, and I love the turn that it takes when it switches to the minor key, shifting the mood of the song significantly, but then eventually returning to that major tonality that we heard from the opening section of the song. Then we continue with Fearless, which is another acoustic-centered track with these electric guitar layers on top of it. This song to me has always just felt like a really solid, feel-good early 70s rock track, and it contrasts the opening 2 songs very nicely. Then we continue with a Roger Waters track titled Saint-Tropez, another acoustic-centered track with these jazzy piano chords on top of it, and a walking bass line against a regular backbeat drum groove, which creates this really interesting dichotomy of sounds, which makes this song sort of hard to categorize stylistically because it definitely has some jazzy elements to it, but I wouldn't say it's a full-blown jazz song because of the straight feel with the backbeat in the drums as opposed to that swung 8th note feel. Then we have a song with more of a comical twist to it titled Seamus, which is a bluesy song with acoustic and electric guitars and piano, and it is written about a dog that belonged to Steve Marriott from Humble Pie, which we hear barking all throughout the song. And this has always been the one track on this album that I'm sort of indifferent about. I don't think it's a bad song, but I could definitely do without it as well. But then we go to side 2 and conclude the album with the incredible 23-minute long Pink Floyd classic Echoes. Easily my favorite song on here. Beautiful lyrics from Roger Waters doing commentary on human interaction and the way people communicate to one another, and the idea of empathy and how different people choose to use it or not use it. Musically, it's amazing as well, with some beautiful chord progressions, as well as that amazing single note line that descends chromatically and comes back up. The jammy section grooves really nicely and has great solos from David Gilmour as well. And then it takes a detour of over 8 minutes going into this very ambient section, which eventually builds back up and brings back the final verse on a nice and satisfying manner and just concludes the album beautifully. And like I said on the previous album, Atom Heart Mother, I don't think that their ability to write these really long songs that completely keep your attention and keep you engaged throughout, I don't think that they had really mastered that art form on the previous album, but I think once they wrote the track Echoes, I think it's very clear that they've really mastered that art form of writing these really long and engaging tracks that are just so enjoyable and such a journey to listen to. So with the exception of Seamus, I pretty much really enjoy every track on here. I think the collaborative writing is the best that it's been up to this point. I think they are really finding their own voice and delivering us a really solid batch of tracks and really creating some anticipation for what great music is to come in future albums. So a very good album. This one gets an A. All right, next we have their 7th studio album and 2nd soundtrack from 1972 titled Obscured by Clouds, and I will give this one a B. I think this album is okay, but there's definitely a chunk of it that I find kind of boring, and similar to what I had said about their other soundtrack, More, I think the fact that it's a soundtrack does limit the parameters of their writing and doesn't translate into an album with a lot of really standout tracks, but there are a couple of songs on here that I do really enjoy, like Burning Bridges, What's the Deal, Childhood's End, and Stay. My favorite is definitely Burning Bridges. I think that's a really pretty, dreamy, and ethereal track. Childhood's End is a really solid David Gilmour track as well. So this album does have a handful of songs that I like, but I wouldn't say that any of them are really exceptional or standout Pink Floyd tracks, with the possible exception of Burning Bridges. I do really like that song a lot, but it does also have a handful of songs that are skip-overs for me. So not a bad album, but not a great album either, so this one gets a B. Okay, next we have their 8th studio album from 1973 titled Dark Side of the Moon, and unsurprisingly, this one gets an S. Absolutely incredible album, and this is typically the record that is sort of like the poster child for Pink Floyd, and so many people list this as their favorite Pink Floyd album, and it's actually not my number one favorite, but it is my number three, so it makes the top three, which is obviously still very good. Compositionally and musically, this is such a significant improvement upon everything else that they've done up to this point, and to make such a significant step up on your eighth album is really impressive and goes to show that Pink Floyd was just getting started with all of the great music that they were going to give us in future years. This album is thematic, with songs that often connect into one another, and they discuss a lot of the pressures that they had faced as a band, as well as doing some commentary on Syd Barrett and the mental health problems that he had faced in the group. From a songwriting standpoint, I think every member was on top of their game throughout this, with all of their contributions being just absolutely perfect, and the wide use of different synthesizers and tape effects creates these amazing moments of psychedelia that go into completely different territories from anything else that we have heard up to this point, and the blend of the instrumental ambiance with the vocal-centered tracks just balance each other out perfectly. Production-wise, this album is about as good as it gets to, with every member of the band contributing. I feel like talking about how great this album is almost becomes redundant at a certain point, because I feel like everyone is aware of it, and it almost feels like preaching to the choir when you talk about this record. But a few of my favorite tracks on here are Breathe, Time, and Us and Them. I absolutely love the arpeggiated chord progression in Us and Them. The use of the minor major 7 chord is super interesting and something that is not commonly used in rock music. So from a music theory perspective, I find that very interesting. And as most people are also probably aware of, the 7/4 time signature in Money is also very interesting, and a song that sort of serves as like the poster child for a rock song that uses odd time signatures, because with the exception of obviously progressive rock, we don't often hear very many odd meters in more straight-ahead rock songs. From an instrumental standpoint, I absolutely love the keyboards, organ, and synth sounds that are used throughout. The addition of the female backing vocal section adds such a nice additional layer of depth and beauty to the album. The vocal parts on Great Gig in the Sky are just bone-chilling, and the addition of the saxophone as well on Money and Us and Them is a very nice touch, with both songs being completely different stylistically, but the way that they use the sax for each of those tracks is very tasteful. Another thing that I love about this album too is it's got so many great songs, but they are the types of songs that I can listen to over and over and over again and never get tired of them. I can't even count how many times I've listened to this album, as I'm sure most people listening to this also feel the same way, and it's just, an incredible improvement upon everything that they've done up to this point. So, no big surprises here. Pink Floyd's most classic and well-regarded album of their discography, and one of their best in my opinion. So this one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their 9th studio album from 1975 titled Wish You Were Here. This one also gets an easy S, an incredible album, and this one is actually my second favorite Pink Floyd record. I think from front to back, this is a perfect album. It only has 5 tracks, but they pack in so much amazing music within those 5 tracks and deliver us one of the best Pink Floyd albums of all time, in my opinion. It opens and closes with a 9-part piece titled Shine On, You Crazy Diamond, which is a very emotional and touching tribute to Syd Barrett, and a perfect example of a Pink Floyd song that is on the longer side, but is just completely engaging and exciting from beginning to end. The chord changes during the jammy sections happen at the perfect spots. David Gilmour's solos are incredible, and when the vocals enter and the chorus hits, it just feels so huge and epic and satisfying. The perfect opening and closing track that is a Pink Floyd classic and one of the defining songs of this album. Side 1 concludes with a haunting Roger Waters composition titled Welcome to the Machine. I absolutely love this song, and I would say it's my other favorite on here next to Shine On, You Crazy Diamond. I love the vocal work. The synth sounds they use are just incredible, and in general, it's such a great Roger Waters track, and I always particularly love the more haunting and scary sounding tracks of Roger Waters. I think he has this really unique ability to write songs that are truly terrifying, and I think this is a great example of that. Side 2 then opens up with Have a Cigar, which features vocals from English vocalist vocalist Roy Harper, another amazing and classic Pink Floyd track on the more rocking side, and I think the placement of this one is perfect and provides a really great contrast to the darker mood of side one. And then that is followed by the title track, Wish You Were Here, which is obviously another Pink Floyd classic, a beautiful acoustic track. David Gilmour claims that this song is about Syd Barrett, but Roger Waters says that it's about himself and wanting to be in the present moment, so it seems to be open to interpretation as to what it's about, but nevertheless a classic Pink Floyd song and a great Roger Waters and David Gilmour collaboration. So I do not have a bad thing to say about this album, opening and closing with Shine On You Crazy Diamond, and then having the other three amazing tracks sandwiched in between them creates an amazing journey of an album with so many different feels and moods, and a couple of Pink Floyd's most classic songs of all time, and another album that has incredible replay value. I can listen to it over and over and over again and just never get tired of it. So a perfect album, in my opinion, another one that gets an easy S. All right, moving on, we have their 10th studio album from 1977 titled Animals, and this is another one that gets an S, and this is actually my favorite Pink Floyd album. This has always been their most standout and exceptional album to me. Similar to their previous release, this one consists of 5 tracks, with 3 of them being on the longer, more stretched out side, with a generally dark mood to them, and then the opening and closing tracks, or Pigs on the Wings Part 1 and 2, are these shorter, more happy, minute-and-a-half acoustic guitar and vocal tracks, which contrast the other 3 songs very nicely. The album is a concept album doing commentary on the political conditions of Britain at the time, focusing on issues like inequality, traits that are found in ruthless upper-class businessmen, and the power dynamics between the upper and lower-class workers that fuel this inequality. And the different animals used in each track are serving as a metaphor for these different traits that we see. Roger Waters composes the majority of this album, with the exception of Dogs, which was written by him and David Gilmour. And I think compositionally and lyrically, Roger Waters is at his peak on this album, and I think his frustration with the political climate of that time clearly fueled some of the best songs that he's ever written for Pink Floyd. Dogs is quite possibly my favorite Pink Floyd song of all time. It's always hard to pick a number one favorite, but I pretty consistently fall back to that song as my favorite. It just has so much depth to it throughout its 17 minutes. The chord progression of the main section is so harmonically adventurous and dark, with the guitars tuned down a whole step, adding an additional layer of heaviness to it. The section changes and the way they weave in and out of different feels and chord progressions throughout the song is done so beautifully. David Gilmour has a couple of incredible solos throughout, playing some really interesting stuff. On his final solo, we even hear a little harmonized line in the whole tone scale, which is very unorthodox and just adds to that dark and haunting underpinning of this song. Lyrically, we have a very dark commentary on upper-class businessmen and the terrible things that they are willing to do to get ahead, and the complete lack of humanity and honesty in that cutthroat environment that they find themselves in. I love how Roger Waters comes in with vocals on the final verse as well. It's a very nice surprise and a change up from everything that we heard in the first 12 minutes. And like I mentioned before, with Pink Floyd just mastering the art of writing very long songs that completely keep you engaged throughout and wonder where it's going to go next, to me this is one of the best examples of that. I just cannot say enough good things about this song. Then that is followed by a Roger Waters track titled Pigs, 3 different ones, which is a commentary on businessmen, but also commenting on Margaret Thatcher, who was a conservative politician at that time. Roger Waters has always been very outspoken politically, and that is abundantly clear all throughout this album. I really love the use of the talk box halfway through by David Gilmour being used to mimic the sound of a pig, and again, some beautiful guitar solos throughout this as well. I think David Gilmour's solos are definitely some of my favorite guitar work of their entire discography. Then we continue with Sheep, which I think concludes the set of 3 songs so beautifully, starting out more subdued with these ambient keyboards, building, and eventually this driving bass line comes in on top of it, which leads into this really hard-hitting and intense groove that sets this beautiful foundation for Roger Waters' haunting vocal melody just to flourish over it. I love his long held-out notes at the end of each vocal phrase. It's so badass and intense, and dynamically this song goes in all sorts of interesting directions, and I love when it switches temporarily to the major key for that instrumental section in the last 2 minutes of the song. A very nice little surprise and and shift in mood for a temporary period. A beautiful conclusion to the set of 3 long tracks from this album. And like I said, I think Roger Waters was on top of his game compositionally for this, and David Gilmour's contributions from a guitar standpoint are absolutely exceptional. And yeah, I just cannot say enough good things about this album. This one will always be my number 1 favorite Pink Floyd album, and sometimes I think it's a little bit underrated in some people's lists. I think some people are kind of sleeping on this album, and oftentimes when I talk to sort of more normal music listeners who aren't diehard Pink Floyd fans, it seems like the 3 main albums that they've heard are Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall, and I feel like Animals can kind of be forgotten about for some people. So, anybody who is listening to this who hasn't heard that album, I would highly recommend it. I think it is their best album of their discography. This one is an easy yes. Alright, next we have their 11th studio album from 1979 titled The Wall, and I will also give this one an S. Another incredible album, and from 73 to 79, I think Pink Floyd was on fire and just putting out one incredible album after the next. This is another concept album and a rock opera that does a lot of commentary on feelings of isolation and disconnect, which is symbolized by the building of a wall around the main character named Pink, who is based on Syd Barrett, and some of the tracks also contain some commentary on different events that affected Roger Waters' life as well, like losing his father in World War II. About 90% of the songs on here were written by Roger Waters, with a couple of collaborations between him and David Gilmour sprinkled throughout, and I think as far as double albums go, this is about as good as it gets. Every side of this is completely engaging, and you have no idea what sorts of turns the songs are going to take, and it also produced a handful of Pink Floyd's most classic hits of all time, like Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, Hey You, Comfortably Numb, and Run Like Hell. Musically, there are some very dark and eerie moments as well, with tracks like One of My Turns, Is There Anybody Out There, and Don't Leave Me Now, which is actually centered around an augmented chord, which creates this really haunting effect. And again, a great example of the darker and scarier side to Roger Waters' writing, which I love so much, and we clearly hear that side of him a lot on this, especially on the track Hey You. I think that's a particularly terrifying song. There have been a couple times where I was driving late at night and that song was on, and it was a truly terrifying experience. I think throughout this album there's a really great blend of the more artsy and operatic types of songs combined with some really pretty acoustic tracks as well, like Mother and Goodbye Blue Sky, and there's also some more straight ahead rocking tracks as well, like Young Lust. I will say that from a guitar perspective too, David Gilmour's solo on Mother is easily in my top 3 favorite Pink Floyd guitar solos. Just so incredibly beautiful and melodic. And as far as favorite tracks on here goes, a couple of standouts for me are Hey You, Goodbye Blue Sky, Mother, Comfortably Numb, and In the Flesh. And like I said, I think this album is incredibly consistent from front to back. In addition to the previous album, Animals, I think also on this one, Roger Waters' writing was at its peak, and it spawned so many great Pink Floyd classics while also delivering a very intriguing concept album that takes us through a very intense and enjoyable journey. So, incredible album, another one that gets an easy S. Alright, next we have their 12th studio album from 1983 titled The Final Cut, and I will give this one an A. That may surprise some people, but I really enjoy this album. I know a lot of fans are divided on this one, but I've always had favorable thoughts about this record. Roger Waters is in the driver's seat for this one, doing all of the songwriting, and the album is a mix of unused tracks for The Wall, as well as some new material. It was originally intended to be the soundtrack for the 1982 movie The Wall, but then because of the Falklands War, Waters had decided to change directions and write more material as a response to what he thought was the unnecessary invasion of Argentina by the UK. I think musically, if you are a fan of The Wall, it definitely has similar flavors to that, and to me it feels like a part 2 to The Wall, which is one of the reasons why I enjoy it so much. I think the album has a great momentum to it. The tracks blend into one another very nicely. There's a great balance of more mellow tracks that are either guitar or piano centered, combined with some more epic tracks that have these big orchestral backgrounds, giving them a very cinematic and almost musical-like feel to them at certain times. I enjoy the majority of this album, but my favorite part is the succession of tracks from 1 to 4. I absolutely love opening the album with the post-war Dream and then continuing with the next 3 tracks. One of the few is hands down my favorite song on here. Again, another one of those really haunting and eerie sounding Roger Waters tracks, and although it's only a little over a minute and 15 seconds long, it leaves such an impression on me and really stands out. A couple of other favorites on here for me are When the Tigers Broke Free, the Fletcher Memorial Home, the title track, The Final Cut, and Not Now John. And unfortunately, this would be the last album with Roger Waters as a member of the group, but I think this was a great final release for him to go out on, and it incorporates all of the elements that I love about Roger Waters' songwriting, as well as his outspoken political beliefs and activism. So I think this is a very good final Roger Waters album. This one gets an A. Okay, next we have their 13th studio album from 1987 titled A Momentary Lapse of Reason, and I will give this one a B. Not a bad album, but not one of my favorites either. This is the first album to not feature Roger Waters, who had left the band in 1985, and it also marks the return of keyboardist Richard Wright, who had actually been absent since getting fired from Roger Waters during the recording of The Wall. I think I forgot to mention that when we were talking about The Wall. But David Gilmour had decided to do some collaborations with the compositions on this album, and he also used some tracks that were originally intended for his third studio album, and I think it resulted in some good songs and a few skip-over songs as well. I do tend to find The Final Cut a little more consistent and engaging than this album, but it definitely still has a couple of tracks that I think are great, like Learning to Fly, The Dogs of War, On the Turning Away, and Terminal Frost. There are a couple of other tracks on here that I don't mind as well, but I wouldn't say any of them are really standout exceptional songs for me. And in general, from front to back, I wouldn't say it's a super strong and consistent album with good momentum all the way through, and I do prefer The Final Cut to this one. But like I said, it still has a couple of really solid David Gilmour tracks, so it's an okay album, so I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have their 14th studio album from 1994 titled The Division Bell, and I will give this one a B. I gotta say, of all of the albums on here, I think this was the one that I struggled with the most, and I really had to think about it with the scoring. I debated putting it in A tier, but I do like everything in A little bit more. But I will say it is my favorite of all of the albums in B tier. I think this album is relatively good and definitely an improvement from A Momentary Lapse of Reason. And similar to that album, Roger Waters is out of the band, so the songwriting is done primarily by David Gilmour and Richard Wright, and it will be the last album with Richard Wright on it, as he would sadly pass away in 2008. We have 11 tracks, clocking in at an hour and 6 minutes worth of music. It brings things in with Cluster 1, which opens things up very nicely on a vibey instrumental track with some really dreamy keyboard pads and tasteful guitar fills from Gilmour. There are moments of this song that give me little tastes of the instrumental introduction to Shine On You Crazy Diamond, which is obviously a great thing. Then we continue with track 2 titled What Do You Want From Me? I love this song, and this is actually my favorite song on this album. I think for the first vocal track, it brings things in with such a great energy and also features some incredible guitar solos from David Gilmour. I love the female backing vocals on this one. It adds such a nice touch to this already amazing song. I also really enjoy the follow-up track, Poles Apart. Such a pretty contrast with the dreamy acoustic guitar parts and those classic Pink Floyd organ sounds when the drums enter. So far this album is off to a very good start. And then we have Marooned, which is an instrumental track with some nice guitar work from Gilmour, but definitely not a standout track for me, and I would have been fine with them leaving this one off of the album. Then we continue with A Great Day for Freedom, which is a very pretty piano-centered track that changes up the mood very nicely. I particularly love when the band enters as well. It feels so satisfying after that nice minute and 45-second build. After A Great Day for Freedom, I do think the next few tracks take a little dip in momentum compared to the opening chunk, which is one of the reasons why I put this in B tier. But then I think there are a couple of tracks at the end of the album that do a good job of redeeming it and bringing the momentum back up, particularly with Keep Talking and the closing track High Hopes, which are both very solid songs. But regardless of that, I do think that this is a strong album. I think my main critique would be that so many of the songs are 6 minutes in length or longer, so sometimes this album can feel like a little bit of work to listen to all the way through. And if I had to compare this one to the final cut, I would still say that I like the final cut slightly more, and I do listen to that one a little more often. But regardless, I do think that this is a good album with a handful of really great tracks and an improvement from the previous release. So this one gets a B, but like I said, this is my favorite album from B tier thus far. Okay, now we have their 15th and final studio album from 2014 titled The Endless River, and I will give this one a B. This is an interesting album for a lot of different reasons. For one, I don't think most people anticipated that there would ever be another Pink Floyd album after The Division Bell, and I remember when I heard that this was coming out back in 2014, I was definitely shocked and excited to see what it would bring. And this album has David Gilmour in the driver's seat since Richard Wright had passed away 6 years prior, and it would feature a combination of music that was written during the Division Bell sessions, combined with some new material written by Gilmour. This album is almost entirely instrumental, with only the final track having vocals, and I do enjoy this album, but I think because it's largely instrumental and so ambient, it is definitely an album that I have to be in a particular mood to listen to, and I wouldn't say that it has the same replay value as a lot of other Pink Floyd albums for me, but irregardless of that, there are still some really magical moments throughout this, and a lot of spacey instrumental passages that remind me a lot of stuff that we heard on the Wish You Were Here album, which was a very pleasant surprise. I think if there had been a few more vocal tracks sandwiched in between all of the instrumentals, it probably would have enhanced the album at least a little bit, because the final track, Louder Than Words, which is the one vocal track, is definitely my favorite song on here, and it shows that David Gilmour is still clearly capable of writing really beautiful vocal songs like he did on The Division Bell. So while I wouldn't say this is one of the best Pink Floyd albums, it is still a treat that we get a new batch of David Gilmour instrumentals 20 years after the release of the album before that. And this album is definitely filled with all sorts of classic Pink Floyd moments, so I think it can still satisfy any diehard fan, but is not an amazing album, I don't think either. So I will give this one a B. All right, we did it. We went through all 15 of their studio albums, and this is what I ended up with. It was a real joy to go back and revisit these records, because there were definitely a few here and there that I hadn't spent as much time with, as I'm sure is the case with a lot of Pink Floyd fans, but it was a lot of fun going through and revisiting the classics, as well as rediscovering new things in some of the other albums that I wasn't as familiar with. So thank you so much for listening. I hope it was enjoyable, and please, like I said, let me know where you agree and disagree. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts, and if you are interested, feel free to check out some of my other tier lists as well, which will be linked in the comments and the description, and see if there is anything else that you might like. All right, that is it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.